Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished professor at Rutgers Law School and author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. I am also the executive director of the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race, and Rights. You can follow me on social media at Sahar Aziz Law and learn more about my work at saharazizlaw.com. The Center for Security, Race, and Rights, also known as CSRR, engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To learn more about CSRR's work, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR and at RUCSRR. And if you find this podcast informative, share it with your networks, rate us, and please consider making a tax-deductible donation by going to our website, csrr.rutgers.edu, and press the donate button. And please give generously. In today's episode, I'm in conversation with legal scholar Professor Maryam Jamshidi to discuss the law and politics surrounding Israel and the United States' unilateral and unprovoked military attacks on Iran starting in February 28, 2026. As Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu publicly admitted, he and the Israeli government have been preparing for a war to topple the Iranian regime for over 30 years. Knowing they cannot do it alone, Israel attempts to persuade the United States to engage in a war of aggression against Iran failed under the Bush, Obama, and Biden administration. The reasons for restraint by past U.S. administrations were often the same. Iran posed no direct threat on or imminent attack toward the U.S. that legally justified an offensive war of aggression. Moreover, the risk of a global economic downfall and the exorbitant price tag of a major war outweighed the benefits of removing a hostile government. And perhaps most importantly, from a military perspective, the United States had no exit strategy. Indeed, these were the same reasons that led to the Democratic Party winning the White House in 2008 after the U.S.'s expensive and endless wars in Iraq and Afghanistan after 2001. Also for the same reasons, Republican politicians campaigned on an America First platform in the 2021 elections by explicitly rejecting wars of choice in the Middle East that cost American lives and treasure. And yet, Republican President Donald Trump has both violated that promise to his constituents and granted Israel its 30-year dream to start an offensive war on Iran without any credible evidence of an imminent threat. The result has been predictably catastrophic for the Middle East and the global economy. The war has engulfed the Gulf states into the war. The Strait of Hormuz is closed to the 20% of global supply of oil and natural gas. Energy prices are skyrocketing across the world. Tehran is being bombarded on a daily basis by Israel and the United States. And the war is costing American taxpayers $1 billion per day. I discussed these aspects and many more about the war on Iran with Professor Maryam Jamshidi, who is an associate professor at the University of Colorado School of Law. Professor Jamshidi is also an expert on national security and international law with a focus on the Middle East and Iran. Let's hear what our guest has to say about the latest U.S. endless war in the Middle East that is dominating national headlines. Professor Maryam Jamshidi, thank you so much for joining us today on the Race and Rights Podcast to offer your expert analysis and your personal experiences as an Iranian American. There's a lot to process. There's a lot going on right now, and there's a lot of noise in the political discourse and even the legal analysis on Israel and the United States unilateral attacks on Iran. And my position is that it was unprovoked and certainly not based on any imminent threat that's been proven. And so to me, it's pretty much of an easy case of a violation of the laws of war. But Surprisingly, there are some scholars who claim that it is justified. And so I think it's really important to hear your perspective as an international legal scholar, as a regional expert, a country expert, and again, as someone who has kind of the positionality and personal experiences of being an Iranian American. So welcome to the Race and Rights podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Sahar. It's great to be here.
So let me start with kind of a broad question so that you can provide our listeners with some kind of backdrop. What
Mhm.
do you believe, in your expert opinion, is the political impetus behind the United States attacking Iran right now, rather than 6 months from now, a year from now, or even a few years from now? Why now?
Well, I mean, I think it's a variety of different factors. I mean, there was obviously the strike that happened in June, another illegal war, a crime of aggression that was initially led by Israel and then joined in by the United States, followed by very quickly by a ceasefire brokered by the Trump administration. I think Trump saw that as a success, as a gambit that paid off. He bragged, of course, after that, that they had completely obliterated Iran's nuclear program, which, of course, leads one to ask questions about what exactly they're doing now. But I think that was viewed as a success by the Trump administration. And then, of course, there's the other quote unquote success that the Trump administration had in Venezuela, which happens in early January, where the Trump administration goes in very quickly, abducts the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife, and brings them to the United States to face trial on a very dubious set of criminal indictments, and manages to do that without, engaging in any long or meaningful armed conflict with Venezuela. I mean, they certainly bombed Venezuela and committed aggression against Venezuela in order to abduct Maduro, but they were able to very quickly come to an agreement with the vice president. I believe she was the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, who stepped in, became president, and has effectively been doing what the United States wants in Venezuela, handing over oil and other related things. So he had these two successes that certainly went to his head. We saw him stampeding around demanding Greenland after that, very soon after the success in Venezuela, too. And then, of course, there were events inside of Iran. So there had been protests that started in late December after the currency in Iran cratered yet again. And those demonstrations were accelerating. They started reportedly in sort of smaller areas in Iran, which is somewhat unusual, but they eventually spread to the capital. And then, a few days after his gambit in Venezuela, both he himself and the son of Iran's deposed Shah, Reza Pahlavi, made statements that, seemed to encourage protesters to really just, come in waves onto the streets, because if they did that, they stood to topple the regime potentially with external help. So on January 8th and 9th, people did head into the streets in large numbers, and there was a bloodbath. And, the Trump administration initially seemed to be using that set of events, as the justification for some kind of armed attack on Iran. So by early January, it looked like the success in June, the success in Venezuela, coupled with, this humanitarian crisis inside the country that the United States was certainly only interested in exploiting, would become the sort of titular justification for some kind of armed attack. But the United States wasn't ready. It did not have the assets and the troop deployment in the region to be able to actually engage in some kind of, massive bombardment of Iran. One that would be short, which is what Donald Trump wants, and decisive. So the United States decided to embark on the fiction of negotiation with Iran. Again, like I said, he sort of made it seem initially like it was all about the protesters. We're going to come in and defend you. But then it very quickly stopped being about the protesters during the course of this negotiation. It became, again, about Iran's supposedly obliterated nuclear program, about its ballistic missiles, about its support of various resistance groups in the region. And that then becomes the focal point of discussion between the Trump administration and Iran, the focal point of discussions in the media about, what the future holds for US-Iran relations. During those negotiations, which the Iranians also did not believe were serious, the Iranians were also preparing. They had been preparing since June for another war. They believed another war was coming. They saw the demonstrations as an extension of that war. There were armed groups within those demonstrations, individuals who were certainly not armed domestically, who were almost certainly armed by outside actors. They saw those demonstrations as an extension of war, and they saw this negotiation as basically an excuse the Trump administration was using to be able to arm itself to a point where it could launch a war with Iran. So Iran continued to prepare for this while trying to engage in negotiations with the United States. And, of course, who you listen to, who you believe determines how you see, whether or not the Iranians were in fact negotiating in good faith, or not. But I don't think Iran wanted a war. I think Iran would have liked to be able to come to some sort of deal with the United States, but I don't think any deal was really possible. So, once the assets are in the region and Trump is ready to go, he effectively, flipped the switch, in tandem with Israel. Obviously, they came into this together, and the Israeli factor, is massive in all of this and longstanding. And, decided that the time was ripe, that Iran was weak, that the United States was, on the up and up in terms of its ability to project power. And this was the right time to strike.
So I want to step back a little to the June until February, right? June 2025 until February 2026, which is when Israel and the United States attacked Iran. And the assassination of Khamenei, who was the supreme leader, both in terms of political leader, but also, Shia spiritual leader.
Mm-hmm.
And how can we understand Iran's response or lack thereof in last June? How did those 9 months in between or 6 months in between impact the Iranian response now? In any government, there's always different factions. There are people who are more hawkish, people who are more dovish, people who are in the middle.
Right.
And Khamenei, he's now dead and he's been assassinated. Was he someone who was restraining Iran, or was he someone who, where did he fit into that kind of spectrum of responses? Because one could reasonably conclude that Iran's response was quite tepid, if even existing at all, to the June attacks on their country, right? The bombings that were, again, unprovoked, completely unilateral, and a violation of the law of war. And yet there really wasn't a military response, at least one that was visible. So could you explain to us a little bit about the internal political responses within Iran until this latest, outright assault on Iran by Israel and the United States?
There was for sure a response in June by Iran. That was, Iran's most extensive and meaningful set of military responses, I would say, to Israel, despite being the victim of very long-standing set of attacks, some on assets outside of Iran, some covert against individuals in Iran for a very long time. Israel has been engaging in covert activity in Iran since at least the 2010s. There have been multiple assassinations of civilian nuclear scientists in Iran for a very, very long time that are widely believed to have been the actions of the Israeli government through, various actors inside Iran. There were those. Then Iran becomes involved in Syria, and Israel starts targeting Iranian personnel and assets inside Syria. And that, was a steadily increasing and continuing phenomenon during the course of the Syrian civil war. They assassinate Qasem Soleimani during the first Trump administration in January of 2020, an incredibly shocking development. He was reportedly there actually for diplomatic negotiations. He'd gone to Iraq and he was assassinated by the Americans. Iran responded in a very tepid way, very tepid to that. Then, over the course of, post October 7th, you see the Israeli attacks against Iranian assets in Syria getting more aggressive. You have, I think it was a consulate that was hit, an Iranian consulate. It was an Iranian diplomatic building that was hit in Syria. I believe that was, I could be getting the dates wrong, 2024. That was quite a big deal. Then you had, and this is more of a rumor than confirmed, but I think there are reasons to think that this did in fact happen. You had the sudden death of the Iranian president Raisi, as well as several other high-ranking officials in a helicopter crash a few months after or around the time of the embassy attack, that some believe Israel was behind, that was related to the Beeper attacks. Then you had the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh while he's in DC. The targeted assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, I just said DC, while he was in Tehran on a political and diplomatic visit on the occasion of the election of the new Iranian president after the assassination or death of the first one, which Iran does not immediately respond to. It responds to later, and so on and so forth. So there were so many things that had been done increasingly by Israel to Iran to the point where, by 2024, they're attacking Iranian territory. They're on Iranian, they were already attacking the nuclear scientists, but that was a little bit more covert. This was more explicit, right? And Iran's responses, again, are very, very limited, are very restrained, if they even come at all, right? They totally downplayed the Raisi thing, and they said it was a plane, it was a helicopter crash, and that's all it was, and that continues to be the line. Again, this is just rumors, and I don't want to spread rumors, but there are reasons to be suspicious about that. And then when June comes, that's obviously a massive attack by Israel, one which they are proudly bragging about. Obviously, they can't not. And they assassinate a whole host of Iranian military personnel, as well as civilian nuclear scientists. They continue to do that during those strikes, killing people in their homes. And Iran was not prepared. Iran was not prepared. It was negotiating with the United States again during this time. They had, I believe, completed 6 rounds of negotiations on the nuclear issue when this happened, and they were totally caught on the back foot. And it took them something like 13 hours to muster any kind of response. But they did respond, but they still remained restrained. They did not do what they did this time. They did not try and make it regional. They did not attack the U.S. bases in the Gulf, which provide advance warning to Israel to ensure that Iranian ballistic missiles that are launched can't actually successfully hit their targets. They didn't do any of that. They remain restrained.
And you're saying they remain restrained you're talking about the June attacks?
They remain restrained in June. They did not attack, like I said, any U.S. bases. They did not attack anything that was directly connected with the United States, because the United States wasn't involved until the very end. And when the United States does get involved and does do the strike on the Iranian nuclear sites, Donald Trump very quickly brokers a ceasefire after that, and the Iranians agree. And one of the lessons that was learned, I think, from that was that Iran made a mistake certainly in trusting the Americans to negotiate in good faith, but secondly, in agreeing to the ceasefire. The decision to agree to the ceasefire was not something that was supported by all element decision making actors within Iran. I would assume it was something that Khamenei, the supreme leader, wanted. Otherwise, it would not have happened. But there was dissent to the agreement to agree to that, the end of hostilities at that point, because Iran didn't even feel at the time like it was over. You talk to Iranian analysts, you listen to Iranian analysts who are sort of like providing their commentary about the the 12-day war in June, and in the close aftermath of that, everyone thought that there would be another war. Every single person thought that there would be another war, that this was not over. And so, over the course of the following 6 months, Iran clearly developed a strategy where its decision making would be dispersed, that it wouldn't have centralized decision making, that it would basically empower various individuals within the military structure to make like targeting decisions, to decide, what kind of strategy to pursue. It dispersed its decision making. It also determined that, and the Iranians were very, very, very explicit about this before the war happened. They also decided that this would be a regional war. It would not be limited to Israel and, any US forces that were specifically there to fight. It would involve the region. It would involve creating economic pain, not just for the region, but globally. And that there would be no ceasefire until Iran had successfully reestablished deterrence, meaning that the United States and Israel wouldn't just think twice. Like they would think 100 times, 1,000 times before they struck Iran again. So I think that those were certainly the lessons that were learned from the June War. And I don't know if this was a lesson learned from the June War or something that's developed since then, but it's quite clear now that for Iran, a very important objective is to ensure that the United States is not able to maintain its military bases in the region. That is a very clear objective now that I would assume was part of the planning over the last 6 months as well.
It's interesting, although it sounds like a objective that, at least at this point in time, seems quite unrealistic.
I don't know.
The
I don't know.
idea that the U.S. wouldn't have military bases in the Middle East just seems completely unrealistic.
You do need maybe Donald Trump doesn't understand this, but you do need the consent of those states, to have those military bases on their territory. Those military bases belong to them, right? The United States uses them by and large. But I'm not aware, and I could be wrong, of any military base, at least in the region, where the United States has sovereignty over those bases. There are issues of contract and all of that and breaching, but, these are the product of state consent. These states consented to have these bases here so they could withdraw their consent. Now, whether or not that'll happen is still an open question. But, Iran has done a lot of damage to a lot of these bases. The United States has fully withdrawn its troops from a number of these bases, for example, in Bahrain. I believe in Kuwait as well. There may be others. The reporting is really all over the place, and it's kind of hard to know what's real and what's not. But there have definitely been a lot of troop withdrawals from these bases. The Gulf states have said that these bases should not be used to attack Iran. And we can talk about whether or not that, in fact, has been true. And as I said, Iran has done significant damage to these bases, and in particular to the assets at these bases that made those bases very valuable to the United States and to Israel, including radar detection systems, THAAD systems that are incredibly expensive and are used to provide advance warning to Israel when it comes to incoming missiles from other states. Most of those THAAD missile sites, from what I know, 4 of them have been destroyed. So it will cost the United States a lot of money also. Not that the United
Yeah.
States isn't willing to spend on these things, but like it will cost a lot for the United States to be able to rebuild these bases. And of course, you have to also wonder whether or not the Gulf states are going to continue to want them there, where those bases, instead of being a source of protection for these states, has been a source of threat. The United States has not defended, nor frankly does it have the right to defend, if we're talking about international law, the Gulf states from attacks that Iran has launched on them since this war started.
Yeah, I was, thinking about how seismic the geopolitics, political changes have occurred in the Persian Gulf since Israel
Mm-hmm.
and the US's attack on Iran. And, it's hard to tell from someone I'm not an expert in that part of the Middle East as to whether this would persuade the Gulf countries to distance themselves from the US and effectively do what you're predicting is tell them, keep these bases off our land, or severely restrain their function such that they won't
Mm-hmm.
be attractive targets for future wars, or if it makes them hold tighter to the US and say, oh, now we have even less trust of Iran because, whatever the justification may be from the Iranian perspective, I suspect the Gulf countries, and they've expressed this, are extremely
Mm-hmm.
upset that they're
Yeah,
being targeted and trying to make the argument that they should be separate from this war and that they don't, they're
it's
not
not
playing
their
a
war.
role, even though
Right,
they have the U.S.
right.
bases. But I want
Yeah.
to actually kind of jump into the next related topic, which is contrasting the U.S. approach here against Iran,
Mm-hmm.
where it unilaterally with the Israel together, unilaterally without any provocation of an imminent threat, attacked Iran. Whereas at
Mm-hmm.
least with the U.S. invasion of Iraq, it tried to claim, we realized later, and some people knew in real time that the argument that there were weapons of mass destruction and that
Mm-hmm.
Saddam Hussein was just about to attack, but at least they went through the motions. At least they tried to pretend
Mm-hmm.
like international law applied. Why is the U.S. doing this? Why is Trump not even trying to create a regional coalition in contrast to Bush?
Yeah.
Why is Trump effectively, and Rubio admitted it. Yeah, we knew Israel was going to attack, so then we attacked with them because we knew we would be attacked, and they just
Right.
kept changing their story. But
Right.
I think it's reasonable to conclude that Israel is driving this, Netanyahu is driving this, and
Mm.
not that Trump necessarily doesn't want to attack Iran, but Israel is a major, major player
Major.
in the timing, in the
Mm-hmm.
scope. And
Mm-hmm.
so, could you explain to us why the U.S. is cooperating so much and why Israel is taking the lead and why Israel is obsessed with Iran, other than the obvious, they don't want them to have nuclear weapons. But of course, the easy response is, well,
Right.
Israel, you have nuclear weapons and the U.S.
Right.
has nuclear weapons. But what's happening here? Why this obsession with Iran by Israel?
Yeah. Just one point on the last topic with respect to the Gulf and the bases. Like, I'm not at all predicting that like the Gulf states will decide, that like they're going to boot out the Americans. I think I agree with you. I think that's like a pretty that's a long shot, but I do think that the relationship between the military in particular relationship, but also the economic relationship between the United States and the Gulf states is definitely on the menu in a way that it never was before. And I think that we will see some kind of change. I doubt that it's going to be a closer cleaving to the United States. I highly doubt that. I think the Gulf states are very angry at Iran, but I think they're very angry, incredibly angry at the United States as well for starting a war that they tried so hard, many of them tried so hard to prevent through diplomacy. So we'll see. So why Iran? I mean, well, I don't know how long you have. Multiple books have been written about like Israel and Iran and the nature of their relationship, and of course the United States and Iran and their relationship, like over a very long period of time. Like for Israel, I mean, God help us. I mean, they are motivated, first and foremost by, a desire to become a regional hegemon Like that's their goal. But they're a tiny, tiny state. And, they might have the strongest military in the region, but, like they're also not exactly, I mean, certainly there are relationships with many regional states is either like a non-issue because they're just so much more powerful, or, they're now like in the Abraham Accords together, So like it's not like they're this, they're in this like fully hostile environment, but it's not easy for a small state with a comparatively small army, even if it's a very strong one, to dominate such a big region with such a massive population with so many countries. So you got to start, like decapitating them, as much as you can. And, they've been successful in Syria, like we now have a territorially disintegrated, weak Syrian state that is fundamentally willing to basically do whatever the United States wants and is likely also helping Israel in this war. You have, again, states that there have been alliances built with either formally or informally. You have states that have just become basically failed states like Lebanon or, close to fail like Jordan, and then you have Iraq was taken out, thanks to, in large part, lobbying by Israel, in particular, Bibi Netanyahu. And then you have two very large states in the region that are, one of which is fully hostile to Israel, and that's Iran. And then another one that could go either way, and that's Turkey, right? And Iran has, after Iraq was sort of taken off the table, which basically happens after the first Gulf War, right? You have this massive international coalition, a coalition that was greenlit by the Security Council, kind of the gold star when it comes to like foreign intervention into a conflict. You have a Iraqi state that emerges from that far weakened, now subject to really crippling sanctions. Iraq was taken off the table, but not fully, right? It needed to be, completely decapitated still, but it was a less of a threat. During that time in the 90s, Israel then fully turns its attention to Iran. Iran had now also come out of the Iran-Iraq war, right? So Iran wasn't busy with its own devastating war. It was trying to rebuild. It was actually trying to reestablish relations with the United States, by the way, but the United States was rebuffing. And Israel sees all of this and turns its sights on Iran. Iran is a massive, massive country, right? Incredibly important from a geographic standpoint with a huge population and immense natural resources. Iran is a natural hegemon in the region, whether you like it or not, because of all those things. And on top of that, we have a government that isn't super friendly with Israel, right? So Israel decides that Iran is basically next on the chopping block. And it's been very consistent in pursuing that objective ever since then. The nuclear issue is just another excuse for trying to ensure that Iran is taken off the table as a regional threat. For the United States, obviously Iran and the US had been, just hand in glove for decades under Mohammad Reza Shah. And the 1979 Iranian Revolution was very much a middle finger to that relationship. It was a FU to Iran being effectively a client state of the United States. And we can talk about whether or not that was like, in fact, still the case. There are a lot of reasons to think the Shah was trying to move away, but, not that the Shah was good. But in any case, the 1979 revolution is a repudiation of US power in Iran and is decidedly anti-imperialist, right? And in that sense, very much also against US interests in the region. But remember, Iran is this massive, geographically, important state with all these resources, right? That now the United States no longer has access to. So for both Israel and the United States, Iran was a spoiler, both because it wasn't aligned in that intimate way it had once been with those states, but also because it was pursuing its own foreign policy agenda in the region, which was about supporting resistance movements in various states that were attempting to push out Israel and the United States even more from the region, Lebanon being one very prime example with Iranian support for Hezbollah. And then there was also support for Palestinian resistance groups who were trying to achieve the right to self-determination for the Palestinian people. And, many people, unfortunately, see all of that as driven by some kind of like endemic anti-Semitism within the sort of like Iranian state. And, I'm not saying that there is no anti-Semitism. Surely there is, but that wasn't the motivation. I mean, the motivation was actually deeply anti-imperialist. The cause of Palestine was an important and central issue in the revolution itself. The Iranian Shah's support for Israel, although tacit, was also something that Iranians didn't like because they were very much aligned with the Palestinians and their movement for self-determination. So the fact that Iran then supports this government that comes into power supports the Palestinians after 1979 is very much connected to that. So there were a lot of reasons for why the US and Israel would want to take this government down. The fact that they did not pursue any kind of international coalition, I mean, Israel obviously doesn't care about that, period. And for this administration, for this regime, everyone likes to use that word to discredit governments. I'll call it the Trump regime. Like the entire raison d'etre of this administration, of this regime, is anti-multilateralism. It's about, unless it somehow serves U.S. interests, but by and large, a hostility to multilateralism that even George W. Bush did not have. Even George W. Bush did not have the hostility to the United Nations, to multilateral, political, legal regimes that this administration has. The only real multilateral initiative they have pursued is this Board of Peace, which is basically like some sort of like corporate oligarchy. I can't even, like the new East India Company headed by its CEO, Donald Trump. It's not, and all power resides with him if you look on the board charter. So that's not really multilateral either.
And I think you have to pay something like
$1 billion
just to be on the board,
to be like a permanent member, but then he has veto over everything, something like that. It's crazy. The charter of this thing is crazy. So why would they, they did need help. They needed the British bases, for example, that they didn't initially get. And then Trump, starts insulting Keir Starmer after he agrees to make the bases available. They did need to be able to use some assets that were held by foreign countries. But he sees the United States, and certainly alongside Israel, as having the most powerful fighting forces on the planet. And that may in fact be correct, But you would think if he wanted to maintain some kind of legitimacy for this action, that he would have made some sort of effort to, get buy-in, at least from the Europeans, who will frankly, would be more than happy, I think in some ways to be involved in this. And again, we can talk about how they are involved in a minute if you want. But yeah, there was no effort because I think there's this belief, this hubris that the United States doesn't need anybody else. The United States has the might to do whatever it wants. His entire foreign policy is kind of based on that premise.
Well, and that then leads us to kind of the international legal issues that arise and what some of us believe. I admit I'm in that camp that international law is dying a very rapid death or is already dead. And of course, we know there's always been this perennial debate within the international legal circles of the relevance of international law and whether it really matters or not. But Trump has certainly provided quite a bit of evidence in support of the camp that has believed that international law is simply just a ruse for Western countries to engage in what kind of post-colonialism in the form of economic and political hegemony. So, but let's assume that international law is still taken seriously. And I think it's important for our listeners to kind of understand the international legal analysis of what just happened, right? And I think we should include the June 2025 attack and also this current war. Can you provide, I know we don't have a lot of time and this could be an entire course, but
Yeah.
can you provide our listeners kind of the key principles that are implicated in these, again, unilateral, unprovoked attacks by Israel and the U.S. against Iran, and what this, what this means, or how do we understand this through an international legal perspective,
Yeah.
notwithstanding that Trump does not care about international law?
Right. So, I mean, there are a couple of principles that are important to both what happened in June and what's happening now. I mean, the first is, the prohibition on the use of force, the crime of aggression. Then we have the right of self-defense. And then we have the international humanitarian law, also known as the laws of war, which sets out rules for who you can and cannot target, what you can and cannot target once an armed conflict has started. So, under the UN Charter, under customary international law, which binds all states, states are not allowed to threaten or use force against the territorial integrity, political independence of other states, and that's before they actually threaten or use, right? And there have been both threats, obviously, especially in the lead up to this particular war. There were massive amounts of threats from the United States, both verbally and in terms of military buildup around Iran's shores that violated Article 2.4. So even if the United States had not actually launched this war, it had already threatened the use of force. And of course, it used force both in June and now. And that use of force 100% rose to the level of a crime of aggression. So, if you attack the territory of a state, if you bombard a state outside of the right of self-defense, outside of being allowed to do so by a Security Council resolution under Chapter 7, you are effectively engaged in the crime of aggression. One of the most serious crimes that can be committed under international law. So the crime of aggression was committed by the United States and Israel, both in June and now. And all of that, the use of force that rises to the level of an armed attack, the crime of aggression, triggered Iran's right to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter, as well as under customary international law. In order to exercise its right of self-defense, it must do so. It must be necessary to exercise that right, and its exercise of the right must be proportional. It must be proportionate. So, it needs to basically. Iran needs to have to respond through its own series of military attacks in order to effectively stop the aggression from occurring, to achieve its objectives of ensuring that it's no longer aggressed against. And then the response needs to be proportionate, which, kind of bleeds into the rules around targeting once an armed conflict has started. So I think there's no doubt that in both situations, like there was an ongoing armed attack that Iran needed to respond to in order to end the armed attack. Was its response in June proportionate overall? I think it arguably was. It was a little while ago, so I can't get into all the details. But, I think by and large, Iran was, as we discussed, relatively restrained in its responses. So, I'm sure there were probably individual violations of the rules on targeting, but broadly, it did feel like a proportionate response to what had happened, to the armed attack and the crime of aggression it had experienced. This time, obviously, it's ongoing. I think there's, obviously still a very strong, if not incontrovertible argument that Iran needed to respond, it had to respond. The question again, though, is has the totality of the response been proportionate? I mean, I can't weigh in on that at this point. I mean, it's so much has happened. I think it's hard to say. What has also been implicated in sort of both attacks are, and this gets more into the IHL stuff, and then I think it would be good to talk briefly about the targeting of U.S. military bases. But in terms of like the actual other kinds of targeting that have been happening, both in June and now, The only thing that you can deliberately target are combatants and military objectives. You cannot deliberately target civilians. You cannot deliberately target civilian objectives. However, when you're targeting military personnel or objectives, it's possible, right, that even if you don't want to, you could incidentally impact civilians or civilian targets. So you need to engage in what's called a proportionality analysis to determine whether or not the targeting of those military objectives and combatants is going to be proportionate relative to the expected civilian losses and the military objective that you're pursuing. Thinking back to some of the things that Israel did in June, first of all, it deliberately targeted civilians. Its strikes, as I mentioned, were not just aimed at military personnel, they were aimed at civilian nuclear scientists. These are civilians. You cannot target civilians, even if they're involved, in helping develop, Iran's nuclear capacity. That doesn't make them combatants. That doesn't turn them into direct participants in an armed conflict or make them combatants. You can't target them. And they were very explicitly targeted. They targeted state media. I don't know. That's not a military. They certainly didn't provide any argument as to how that was a military objective. So there were some direct strikes in the middle of busy streets, in Tehran. 1,000 people died. 1,000 civilians died in June because of the targeting of apartment buildings, because of targeting in streets. So there was deliberate civilian targeting, certainly by Israel in June. And now we continue to see the deliberate targeting certainly of civilian infrastructure and potentially also civilians. The first day of this attack, a girls' school in the south of Iran in a city called Minab was hit. Somewhere between 165 to 180 people were killed, mostly school children between the ages, I believe, of 7 and 12. That school was not hit once. It was hit 2 times. Some report 3 times. There has actually been a lot of investigative reporting on this. It's a little bit inconsistent, but at least one report suggested that the attack seemed deliberate. And while there were military installations close by, those military installations have reportedly not been used in at least a decade. This had become a civilian structure. Again, the reporting on this is a little bit all over the place, but this is what I have read. Was this a situation of mistaken targeting? The reporting also suggests it was the United States actually and not Israel, because Israel was operating in the north, the United States was operating in the south. I don't know. There is an obligation to ensure that your targets are military objectives before you hit them. Something like a school would be presumed to be civilian. So unless you could, very, very well, very clearly establish otherwise, it would need to be treated as a civilian object. There's a potential argument that school may have been deliberately targeted. I don't know why someone would do that, but there's at least one report that suggests that could be true. Probably the most unbelievable and destructive and clearly disproportionate, if we could even call it that, because it was deliberately targeted. So proportionality doesn't even come into play. Attack that the Israel and the US, or just Israel, I think it may have just been Israel that's happened so far, the targeting of the oil depots in and around Tehran. The targeting of those oil depots have unleashed an incredible amount of pollution into the air, into the water, into the land, in and around Tehran. It was so bad yesterday that during the day, the city of Tehran, a city of 10 to 12 million people, was covered in dark clouds. When it rained oil. People were told not to go outside because there was concern that the rain might burn their skin. This attack released carcinogenic chemicals into the air that frankly make this look a lot like chemical warfare. Those were civilian oil depots. I said proportionality before. There's this whole dual use thing. We don't need to get into it, that there's not even a concept in international law, but states like the US and Israel have been very aggressive in promoting that you can attack civilian infrastructure if it's dual use, if it sustains the war effort. I mean, this is the quickest way to just erase any distinction between civilian and military you can possibly imagine. I'm sure this is how they're rationalizing it, but these were civilian depots used by people inside the city. This was their oil resource. And it was exploded, leading to insane fires that basically turned the sky in Tehran into what you would imagine would occur during an apocalypse. And then will have knock-on effects for God knows how long. And this was the targeting of civilian infrastructure.
Right. And I remember when Saddam had lit fire to some of the oil.
Right, in Kuwait.
In Kuwait, the way that the U.S. had responded and had portrayed him as this horrendous war criminal and how it was completely unacceptable, which it was under international law and morally. And yet there doesn't seem to be even a shrug in the United States, which I think just emphasizes or highlights the complete dehumanization, right, of Iranian civilians as part of the broader dehumanization of the Arab and Muslim and Persian civilians in the region. That's
100%.
Yeah,
100%. I mean, this is probably the oil. I mean, they've done all sorts of other things and hit all sorts of other buildings and facilities. And, the last number that I saw was 1,300 civilians killed. I believe that's a fully civilian number. But like this, when you start engaging in strikes that create this kind of environmental pollution, you are killing civilians, not just in the moment, but in the future as well, for God knows how long. Can I talk quickly about the bases just very fast? Sure. So there are a bunch of military bases in the Gulf states surrounding Iran. And I think basically every Gulf country said that their bases could not be used by the United States for purposes of attacking Iran. But Iran has attacked these bases anyway. The general rule in international law is if you do allow your territory to be used to aggress against another country, that is in of itself a crime of aggression. So you can then be attacked. So, if those military bases have been used, to attack Iran, then they are fair game. Iran can attack them, and it doesn't give rise to any kind of right of self-defense on the part of Gulf states. There is, though, a question mark as to whether or not they were being used. There is increasing reporting suggesting that some of them may have been, like the one in Bahrain, was reportedly used to attack a water desalination plant in Iran, which is also a civilian object that cannot be deliberately targeted. The Iranians, I believe, claimed that a base in the UAE was used to launch the attack against the school in Minab. Again, this has not been verified, but that's the claim. There are claims that a base in Kuwait may have been used. There are various reports that Saudi Arabia has allowed either its airspace to be used or its bases to be used. There is a line of argument that I think makes a lot of sense that even if the bases weren't used to engage like directly in the armed attack, if they were used to provide surveillance or other kinds of intelligence that facilitated those attacks, that would also make them susceptible to attack. And as I mentioned, by Iran, that Iran would be able to attack them. And as I mentioned, a bunch of these 8 bases had radar facilities that were, being used by the United States, both to protect Israel and for its own purposes that Iran attacked. I think it's a very fair argument to say that even if those bases were not being used to launch missiles or airplanes, their use in providing this kind of intelligence to Israel and the United States made them susceptible to attack. So I don't think it's in any way clear whether or not Iran violated the sovereignty and the prohibition against the crime of aggression and use of force itself by attacking these Gulf states, at least when it comes to the bases. The bigger question is some of the structures that were attacked from a civilian perspective, like Iran claims that some of these civilian structures like hotels did have like CIA assets in them, Mossad assets in them, that some of them were being used to house U.S. military personnel. Which again, if you're allowing if you know about this and you're allowing your territory to be used for these things, and these things are contributing to the aggression, the unlawful aggression, they can be targeted. So I think Iran has almost certainly gone beyond what it is allowed to do legally in some of its attacks in the Gulf state. But I would say that there's also a lot of gray area when it comes to those attacks.
Well, and I think also what's challenging is the fact that Israel and the United States clearly have completely disregarded many of these international legal principles. And
Mm-hmm.
although that doesn't legally justify Iran or any other country that's being attacked violating international humanitarian law, the laws of war, especially when it comes to, distinguishing between civilian targets and military targets, but it certainly politically makes it much more difficult to persuade nations in general. Who is going to follow the rules in a fight when the other side's not following the rules? And the violations of international law by Israel and the US, especially in targeting civilian infrastructures, politically just sends a clear message that civilian targets are game. We're targeting you. And so if you target us, it's a tit for tat, which is precisely what the rules-based international world order after World War II was supposed to prevent. It is important for us to just make that historical note that the very countries, the Western countries, and Israel claims to be an extension of Western civilization, in quotes, are now violating this order that they claim creates more peace, and at least from their perspective, and yet they're the ones that are sabotaging it. I want to just kind of end our conversation with a pivot to the experiences of Iranian Americans, which I know are very diverse, but you do have a unique perspective and a unique kind of positionality as an Iranian American, who is also a scholar, right, on international law in the region. Can you provide our listeners, a glimpse into what Iranians have been experiencing in the past year since Trump and Netanyahu have been beating the drums of war? Whether it's based on your visits there, whether it's based on conversations or your readings. But what have been the key points of debate within Iranian society over the past year and in the past few weeks, right, since they've been attacked by the U.S. and Israel? How can we understand that perspective? Because, and I know I should say perspectives, and I don't expect you to summarize that diversity of views, but I do think that one of the limitations of being in the United States is how little exposure we get in the media, right, to especially Middle Eastern peoples who are being targeted by our government, our military. And so what insights can you offer?
I mean, this is probably the hardest question that you've asked, because it's really hard to both talk about this personally, like the sort of Iranian and Iranian American experience, and also to capture how diverse it is and how messed up it is in many ways. Another Iranian academic who is just amazing, her name is Narges Bajokli, just published a piece in, I think, the New York Magazine called Hard Feelings, where she actually talks about some of the sort of dynamics, both inside and outside of Iran, around regime change, around the US and Israel strikes. I mean, I guess if I were to create categories, I probably think I would create 3 categories, maybe 4, of sort of types when it comes to, reactions to all of this. I mean, there's the kind of fully supportive of the government and therefore totally against what the United States and Israel are doing. Then there's the not fully supportive of the government, either relatively or absolutely, but against the things that the US and Israel is doing. Then there are those who are fully against the regime and fully in support of what the US and Israel were doing before, but have now changed their minds. And then there are those who fully are against the regime, fully are in support of what the US and Israel have done, and continue to support it after the killing of almost 200 school children, the oil depot stuff, all of it. And trying to explain what motivates all of these different groups is very, very hard. But as you might imagine, it also creates a lot of conflict within the Iranian within the Iranian community, within the diaspora community, within friendships, within families. Because certainly, we are not a monolith. But I think like this level of division is also not something I've ever really seen before within the Iranian American community. And I guess actually in her piece compares what the Iranian community is going through now, especially in the diaspora, to what the Jewish American community went through after October 7th in terms of just like the ruptures, the deep ruptures that are occurring. I would say that, the category of people who fully supported this and continue to fully support this, like we were fully against the government and fully supported what the Trump administration, Israel did before was large. I would say before it actually kicked off, I would say those that continue to support it, despite everything that's happened, are still not insubstantial. I would say those that were always against this, whether or not they support the regime, is comparatively smaller. I would say those of us who never believed that anything good could come from foreign intervention, especially from the United States and Israel, especially armed, have unfortunately been in a minority for a while, which makes it hard to find opportunities to speak about this publicly. It could also be very scary to do so because those who are on the other side of the spectrum are quite aggressive, hostile, and I would say even violent when it comes to defending their positions and trying to silence those who disagree. So this is not just a hard time to be Iranian because your country is being decimated for no reason, for no legal justification, certainly, and certainly not for the benefit of a future better Iran that could serve its population in a way that would be positive and that we could all support. Like, that's not what it's for. It's not just hard because you're watching all of this go down for interests that will never really benefit the country or its people. It's also hard because you're fighting amongst yourselves. You're fighting with your friends and your family. You're scared to speak out because you're worried about death threats or something worse. Some of them have attempted to get Iranians fired from their jobs. Again, we see a lot of shades of, sort of Israel-Palestine stuff here. A lot of the same tactics are used. Trying to get Iranians fired from their jobs, trying to get events canceled, and this isn't the first time this has happened. Back during the Women Life Freedom protests in 2022, this is actually when this stuff got really bad. But, I would say the fracturing now is even worse. And obviously it's coupled with war this time. The categories I described also don't just exist in the diaspora, they exist in Iran as well, So, especially on the first day when Khamenei was assassinated, many people were celebrating inside Iran. Many people were also upset, but I would say probably more people were celebrating or at the very least agnostic. So these dynamics are not just limited to diaspora. It's not like people inside Iran are wholly against what's happening. No, not yet. I don't know how people can continue to hold on to the belief that this is a positive thing, that like it'll bring some, hope to the country down the line. I don't know how anyone inside the country with bombs falling on their heads could continue to think that for much longer. But, I also don't believe that everyone is fully against this inside Iran based on what I know. So,
right. Well, and I think it's important. This perspective is so important because the tendency to homogenize and create monoliths among people in the region is so dominant and does end up producing or reproducing all sorts of stereotypes. But I think, as you said, Iran is like any other country, including the United States. The fact that we have people who support the Trump regime, and I do think regime is a quite accurate description of his attempt to govern this this country. But the fact that people support him, to many of us, is quite surprising, notwithstanding that he's just flagrantly opposed to the rule of law domestically and clearly internationally.
Yeah.
So it's complicated. And I really appreciate you kind of taking the time to provide your perspective, your insights. I hope this triggers our listeners to read more and to learn more. We could never do justice to this complex and rich topic in just one episode of the Race and Rights podcast. And so before we end, do you have any recommendations of authors or books or articles that listeners can refer to if they want to learn more about Iran or the current events in Iran, in addition to your recommendation of Hard Feelings?
Yeah, I have a couple of books that I would recommend. I also have a couple of sort of analysts I would just broadly recommend people seek out. They've been doing interviews, they've been writing shorter news articles. It can be harder to read a book, but they've been putting out much more, digestible, shorter pieces, and also pieces that are sort of in like audio or visual media that might be more accessible. So I would recommend, writing and interviews involving Trita Parsi, Adi Nast, Nargis Bajokli, who I mentioned. Sanam Vakil is not bad. I'm sort of blanking on some names. In terms of books, someone else is actually quite good. He's an Al Jazeera journalist. His name is Ali Hashem. And he will write pieces that I actually think are quite insightful about all this. Another analyst who's actually good, but she's mostly on X. Her name is Emma Sad. She's good on Lebanon and specifically Hezbollah, but because of that, she also has like some pretty good insights on Iran. In terms of books, actually, I bought this book before all of this kicked off, and I'm still not done reading it because it's over 500 pages, but I think it's probably particularly appropriate for audiences in the United States. It's called America and Iran, A History 1720 to the Present by John Ghazvinian. It sort of, the framing is a little bit maybe naive, especially in this moment. It's framed as, the US and Iran used to be friends, like could be friends again. But I would look past that framing because it does really provide quite an overview of modern Iranian history, but also modern Iranian history in terms of its relationship with the West. So, and the US in particular. So I'd recommend that one very, very much. And also another book by Behruz Amori, that's Ghamari, called The Long War on Iran, which is shorter, which actually I'm about to start, but I've heard really good things about it. So those are sort of some of the top of mind books and people I would recommend people seek out.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Professor Jamshidi. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your time. Thank you for triggering, hopefully, more curiosity, intellectual curiosity and questions about this important topic. And I really appreciate you coming on the Race and Rights podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me and making space for this sort of conversation.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.